Welcome to Behind the Books, the program where authors from the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion at Oregon State University discuss their latest works. This episode, A Scripture of Crows by Charles Goodrich. A Distant Relative by Charles Goodrich from A Scripture of Crows.
A tiny leather pouch with legs and a wicked assortment of surgical tools in its mouth. It's a tick clinging to my sock. A simple, blood-sucking bag of appetite and a generous purveyor of Rocky Mountain spotted fever and Lyme disease. Its face looks rather like a hole saw. We are distantly related, I suppose, if you go back far enough, back to some inconceivably remote common ancestor, like, say, my great Aunt Aggie's great-great-uncle, the family's legendary parasite, who came back from Chancellorsville, toothless, emaciated, one-eyed, and crazy, and built himself a tiny cabin at the back of the farm. He wouldn't help with the field work. After the war, the story goes, just wandered the pastures all day, chanting poems to the sheep. And like this tick, he died young, and none of his poems survive.
Talk to us about your inspiration. Do you seek out inspiration with the intention of writing about it, or does it happen organically?
All those things happen. I'm sometimes kind of blown away by experience, and I start cogitating about how to carry that into a poem. Well, other times I feeling like propagandizing a little bit, and then I try to reach out to a particular audience, and that's tougher. I have to be sure to give the language its due and not run roughshod over it with my own intentions. I try to let my writing emerge from my whole life, so my goals as far as reaching audience are the same whether I'm growing tomatoes in my home garden or planning programs for the Spring Creek Project or spending time with my family or writing a poem. I hope to in my life and in my poems to have some kind of a beneficial effect on the world. It's a high challenge, which keeps me on my toes as I go about the day.
When you write, do you consciously seek to inspire change, or do you create in the moment and let the readers find what they will?
Yeah, I have a couple of abiding passions that come up in all my work, my poetry, and my day job at OSU too. That come out of my history, my long career as a gardener primarily, and as a person who likes to be outdoors and somebody who built his own house. I'm really interested in relationships between humans and other creatures, and between humans and the land. So those are passions that come out in every which way. And if they make an argument sometimes of saying that we could do better people, that's fine. But I don't set out to do that necessarily. I just find those kind of interactions to be among the most interesting things going on in my life. So yeah, working as a gardener, I had a lot of firsthand experiences with insects in particular, and have written a lot of poems about insects, and there are some in the new book too. And from those experiences, I learned that things that we take for granted and sometimes consider pests are maybe justifiably pests in that they cause us grief, but they're beautiful, they're smart, they're paying attention to us, oftentimes more than we're paying attention to them. And I started to extrapolate that to all creatures and maybe even to plants, and started to realize that oftentimes the world is more aware of us than we are of the world. And that may be one of the causes of our mistreatment of the world.
You've written in many forms. Is there a particular form that you prefer, or does it depend on the subject?
I write in every genre, prose and poetry and prose poetry, and I just start in and see where I'm going, and sometimes will find that a piece that I started out writing in poetry really would go a lot better in prose, and probably switches on of its own accord into prose. My previous book, Going to Seed, Dispatches from the Garden, was prose poems, and many of those started out as line poems, and then I converted them to prose poems. And some of the prose poems wouldn't stay in prose poems. They wanted to break up into lines. So the rhythms, the cadences, the sound of poetry, alliteration, and rhyme and assonance will usually clue me into what they want to be. And sometimes subject matter is just hard to write about epidemiological studies in line poetry, so you may have to resort to prose if you want to include some kind of Latinate language, difficult arguments.
Touched by Charles Goodrich, from A Scripture of Crows.
In this poem, I try to imagine someone who is aware of the absences in nature. One of the things that kind of inures us to the losses of habitat and animals going extinct is that there's still a lot of beauty around us, and so the phenomena of the sliding baseline leads us to still find solace and beauty in nature even as it is slipping away from us. So I try to imagine what it would be like for someone who was not so protected. So this is called Touched. He complains that his shoulder blades ache if there aren't any geese by the river where the geese should be. All summer he roams the leftover woods, his hands achy and cramped. He claims that clawing huckleberries into his mouth loosens the pain of the absence of bear. I've seen him batting his eyes like crazy in a garden without butterflies. And sometimes his lips start twitching as if he's trying to whistle a precise trill, but even he can't tell what songbird it is that no longer visits our town. The last time we took him swimming, he stayed in the snowmelt river, turning redder and redder, diving under again and again to kick at the cobbles in the stream bed until his feet were cut and bruised. We all knew what wasn't there, Chinook. But when we got him into the car, he said his eyelids wouldn't work, and for 3 terrible weeks, he couldn't close his eyes.
How has your work as director of the Spring Creek Project shaped and inspired the work in A Scripture of Crows, or vice versa?
I thought about that. You know, I've been very fond of saying that my career as a gardener has proven to be good training for running a small nonprofit, that managing a kind of ecological system over time is good training for a desk job of running events and supervising interns and seeing the cycles of events coming and going. I was thinking when you asked that question, so is my training as a poet also good for running a small nonprofit? And I know the last question is going to be, do we have any advice for young poets? And you might say, consider your career as a poet good training for being part of an environmental or an NGO or other organization or literary organization. That kind of the attention to language is absolutely critical in everything that Spring Creek does. In fact, interrogating language is one of our chief contributions, I think, to the community. So if there's a buzzword, take sustainability, for instance, we want to think that we're all for sustainability, but one of the best things we can do is, what does that really mean? And are people hiding behind that? And are there greenwashing of ideas of sustainability? And we can bring in really smart people to talk about that and deconstruct the word, put it back together in more meaningful ways. Yeah, I think that bringing a poet's sensibility to the kinds of events that Spring Creek hosts has been a good skill for me to have.
Your biography talks about the wide array of jobs you've had over the years to support your quote-unquote poetry habit. How have these jobs influenced your writing? And have you always self-identified as a poet first?
I got my fascination with poetry in college. One of the best things I got from my college career. I was blown away, oddly enough, I guess, by the poetry of T.S. Eliot, whose poetry in no way resembles mine and who I don't particularly see as a model and even as a complicated presence in American poetry. The idea that poetry could do that much as Eliot did in The Wasteland or Prufrock was incredibly inspiring to me, and so I wanted to master the tools of the trade and be able to do complicated things with language. Subsequently, I read Walden, and Thoreau was a much bigger impact on me. I read Walden at the time in the early 70s when the Vietnam War was still going on. I had a low draft number. I was very concerned about the political direction of the country, and I was concerned about being complicit with capitalism and with militarism and imperialism. When I read Thoreau, I realized that one could be an honorable dissenter and that you could find your own path. And for me, I decided that probably it would work a lot better for me as a poet not to work as an academic. So I decided not to go on for advanced graduate school, and I decided I didn't really want to make my living as a teacher. What am I going to do? And I hit on the idea when I first moved to Portland, Oregon, of finding work as a groundskeeper. I went to a place, I didn't have any training in it, but I thought if I went to places that had a lot of grass, they might need somebody to mow lawns. And the first place I went was the closest place to where I was living that had a lot of grass. It was Merrillhurst Convent, south of Portland, Lake Oswego, which had a big estate with formal gardens, orchard, Christmas tree farm. They actually had cattle at the time. And I applied for a job as a lawnmower. And they said, the nun that interviewed me said, well, we already have a groundskeeper, but if we ever need help, we might give you a call. Well, their groundskeeper didn't show up to work that day, and he never showed up again. He went on a bender, and they fired him 3 days later, and they called me up and gave me the job not as a lawnmower, but as a groundskeeper for a complicated estate, which I had no particular ability to do. So I went to town, bought Sunset Western Garden book and a pair of good leather gloves, and started in to make myself into a all-purpose gardener. Suddenly, you know, in full responsibility for an 80-acre estate. I dug graves, I took care of a sewage treatment plant. It was a city, it was a small town, you know, and I was fully responsible for it. I loved it, you know. It was a tremendous on-the-job training kind of thing in all kinds of systems management, you know. So it was terrific, and that kind of manual outdoor work left my mind free sometimes to compose poems and essays, and yeah, it was just a great compliment to my aspirations as a writer. So, and actually having found that career, which I went on to do at a number of other locations, in some way took the pressure off me to succeed as a poet, or to ask my literature to be the main source of my self-satisfaction, because I had something else I liked to do. So I could just, that was fine, you know. If I took a long time to mature as a poet. My first book didn't come out till I was 50 years old. And I think that was part of that I didn't feel an overwhelming need to prove myself as a writer. So that would be something, and I would recommend, you're going to ask me if I have advice for young poets. I would say don't put all your energy for your self-conception into your writing. Have other things that you take pride in and enjoy doing, so that when you get those inevitable rejection letters that may go on for a long time, even the acceptance letters can be complicated sometimes and give you difficult emotions to process, that you have other sources that you can turn to kind of space that out. So my career has definitely done that as a gardener.
You've mentioned a few things already. Do you have any other advice for young writers and poets?
You know, the best and oldest and most common advice is still and always stands, and that's to read. Read, 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 read. Everybody you can get your hands on, and talk about reading with your friends, share favorites, think about why other poetry doesn't work for you. Can't beat it. No other way around it. Has to be done. Has to be done. And if you don't like doing that, might want to look for another job, really, because that's part and parcel of the act. The other thing I would recommend to anybody who wants to spend a lot of their time writing and publishing would be to think about ways beyond the typical literary marketplace where your work and work in general might be useful or needed. So I think it's a shame that literature is only read by people who care about literature, and that it doesn't appear as more within the texture of society. So to think of ourselves as citizen poets might be a useful way to be more proactive about bringing literature into broader conversations. So some of my favorite readings have been to open business meetings. If you can talk somebody into saying, let me start with a poem, it changes everything that happens afterwards. It opens up different parts of the mind. Many young writers and teachers will start a class with a poem, even if it's a science class or a class in forestry, and for the same reason. It opens up channels which, if you don't get them open at the very beginning, they're not going to be open. But if you do, then they come into the conversation regardless of whether it's statistics or politics or poetry. So having poems in your pocket to share at whatever opportunity, being willing to be a little public in that way is really good for your own soul and for the culture.
Black Bug, from A Scripture of Crows.
I want to read a poem that is for a poet and a teacher who taught for many years at Oregon State University, Richard Doncliffe. Taught in the English department, and was in the 70s and 80s one of Oregon's very finest poets, and a good friend of mine, and a wonderful gardener too. So this actually features more of his gardening life. He also was a man who lived a very principled, simple, deliberately simple life, including only, as near as I know, only owning one car all of his life, and that's kind of the focal point of this poem, which is called Black Bug. Hunched over the wheel of his 35-year-old Volkswagen, snap brim cap tugged low, my old friend Richard drives past the courthouse with 2 bales of straw wedged in the back seat. He doesn't see me wave, intent as he is on driving well below the speed limit, with a log truck bearing down on his tail, downshifting, blatting out black exhaust. I can taste that trucker's anger, the whole culture's impatience with the Richards of the world, poking along, attending to small things. Among the few who remain unseduced by the glamour of speed, Richard ages uncomplainingly, a John Keats, growing more peculiar by the day, negative capability incarnate.
This has been Behind the Books, Episode 3, A Scripture of Crows by Charles Goodrich. For more information on Charles Goodrich, visit charlesgoodrich.com. To learn more about the Spring Creek Project, visit springcreek.oregonstate.edu.